Welcome back to the show. Today I want to share some thoughts with you on let him off the hook. This show is going to be a personal challenge for me because I struggle with this exact subject. So I live in a glass house, so I want to make sure that we're clear on that walking in, that I struggle with what we're going to be sharing here today. There was a guy that lived a couple thousand years ago by the name of Paul. And Paul was no sissy to life. He had gone through some struggles in his life that I'll get into in another show, but he learned the hard way how to deal with certain people. So in the scripture, he talks about this guy. He wrote a letter to a friend named Philemon. And Philemon, he had some baggage. He had some struggles with a guy who, in essence, was a slave. And in that time, they had slaves back then. So if I pick up the story in verse 8 of this text, he says, "This is why I'm boldly asking a favor of you." He said, "I could demand it in the name of Christ because it's the right thing to do. But because of our love, I prefer simply to ask you, consider this as a request for me, Paul, an older man and now a prisoner for the sake of Christ Jesus." Listen to this. He says in verse 10, "I appeal to you to show kindness to my child, Onesimus." It wasn't his literal child, but a young man. He says, "I became his father in the faith while here in prison." So this guy hasn't been of much use to you in the past, but listen, but now he is very useful to both of us. I am sending him back to you, and with him comes my own heart. He says, "I wanted to keep you here with me for a while, but now I'm in these chains because of preaching the good news. And he would have helped me on my behalf. But I didn't want to do anything without your consent. I wanted you to help because you were willing, not because you were forced. It seems you lost Onesimus for a little while so that you could have him back forever." So Paul was trying to encourage this guy to kind of bury the hatchet. He goes on. He says, "He's no longer like a slave to you. He is more than a slave, for he is a beloved brother, especially to me, for he will mean so much more to you, both as a man and as a brother." So here's where it gets a little hairy. He says, "So if you consider me your partner, welcome him as you would welcome me." Listen, if he has wronged you, this is where I'm struggling. If he has wronged you in any way or owes you anything, charge it to me. I, Paul, write this with my own hand. I will repay it, and I won't mention that you owe me your very soul. I think he just did, right? He says that you need to forgive and forget. Do you struggle with that? Do you struggle with forgiving and forgetting? I really struggle with forgiving and forgetting. So Paul was encouraging Philemon to, again, bury the hatchet and let go what should have been let go a long time ago. Paul understood that without compliments, in essence, he wouldn't get too far in his conversation. So he kind of prefaced his encouragement to this guy to, you've been good, you've done well by me. Now maybe look at this relationship a little differently, because maybe this guy Onesimus has some really good characteristics that we both can leverage to serve other people. And I think that if you think about the people in your own life that have done damage to you, and maybe they have evolved over the years, maybe they have gotten older and learned from their mistakes, but you're still looking at what they've done 30, 40, 50 years ago, if you're old enough, and think that they're the same person that they were 30, 40, 50 years ago. Let me give you an example. I went to school with some young men that were, I'll be polite, that were aggressive. That's a good word. They were very, very aggressive. They got in trouble an awful lot, got into a lot of fights in school. So you fast forward now, 30 plus years, and it's not the same person as it was 30 years ago. They've mellowed, obviously. They've learned from their mistakes. They've done better in life. But yet you and I choose to place these people in the same bucket as they were a long time ago. And Paul was encouraging Philemon to not look at Onesimus in the same light as he had looked at him in the past. And let me revert back to something that I didn't share before. and I've shared it on multiple shows, and I'll share it on future shows. Paul had a considerable sum of baggage in his own life. Paul came from, it's again a very long story, but he came from an environment where he helped people get killed. So he had a lot of skeletons in his own closet, and he was really trying to encourage Philemon to maybe not look at Onesimus in the same light because he had done some things that weren't very kind. So Paul tried to maybe use his own experience for the sake of this guy that Paul knew that he had some talent and some experiences that could help the entire organization, the entire team. In fact, the actual Greek text in this small piece of the story, he says that you thought that Onesimus was unprofitable, but now to you he is useful. I want you to stop and think for a minute or two of all the relationships that you've had over the years, maybe going back 4, 5, 6 years ago, that maybe you think that those relationships, because they were broken back then, or the people had made some serious mistakes, or maybe they've gone down a path that wasn't very healthy for them, that maybe you think they're still on that path because you broke the relationship up way back then. I'm asking you today to maybe relook or revisit some, not all, but some of the relationships that you think are burned and thrown away, but maybe there could be some things that can be redeveloped as a result of you looking at things a different way. So again, this story of Philemon was looking at this Onesimus guy as his slave, but Paul was saying, look at him now as a brother. If you change the context and the viewpoint of how you look at certain people in your life, your entire point of view sometimes changes. I worked in an office years ago. We're talking probably 96 or so. I worked in an office that I assumed that this new secretary that they hired was very nasty. She looked a certain way, she dressed in a certain way, and I just assumed that she had an attitude. And I had been in that office for a while. So she was the new kid on the block. I was the veteran at the time, and I was pretty standoffish because of her appearance, by her vocal tone, by her voice. Her voice was different, I'll put it that way. So I assumed, I judged her based on what I saw instead of what I knew. And I think sometimes you and I run into the same situation where we judge people based on what we see versus when we invest the time to get to know people. I've done that with clients. There's been times when I've walked up to a door or been in a client's house, and just based on human nature, I assume certain things about people. And about 7 to 8 times out of 10, I'm completely wrong about these people because I stereotype, and you stereotype people. You assume things about people that are not very accurate at all. So Paul was trying to use his own baggage to help Philemon to say, you know what, he didn't use these words necessarily, but he said, he was thinking, I'm sure, that I've got all this baggage, all these skeletons in my closet. He was the accessory to murder, for goodness sakes, multiple times. And he thought that, you know what, there came a time where people not forgot about what he did, but they understood that he could evolve, he could get better, he could change his ways. I think sometimes you and I look at people in our own lives and assume that they can't change their ways, when I'm maybe here telling you today that maybe there are people that in your own life that can change their ways, and give them, not all people, because some people are fake, some people are sociopaths, I get it, I realize that. But there's a percentage of people in your past that you may want to rebuild that bridge together and see maybe if there's a win-win relationship in that relationship. So Paul was trying to encourage this guy to build common ground and look at the relationship differently. I'll say it multiple times here today. He looked at the relationship, this gentleman he was coaching, as if you will, an employee-employer relationship or slave-owner-slave relationship. He says, I don't want you to do that anymore. I want you to look at him as a peer, as a brother, as a person that maybe you can learn from each other. And if you and I do that, if I do that, if you do that, to look at people as maybe a win-win relationship, that as you serve them, they can serve you in an ethical, moral, without any expectation of anything in return, I think you're going to run into more times than not that the relationships, not all, I'll say it again several times, not all of them, but there's going to be a few relationships that if you go back and try to rebuild those bridges, that it could be a win-win for everybody involved. So Paul said, he says, if you consider me your partner, he says, welcome him as you would welcome me. And then he goes beyond that, remember? He says, if he's wronged you in any way and he owes you anything, I'll pay it back. Now that's hard. That's hard for me to do, for sure. I'm probably sure it's hard for you to do. If somebody's taking advantage of you and, or somebody else, and you're going to pay them back for their theft or their wrongdoing, I'm not there yet, I have to tell you quite frankly. But Paul was saying that if he cheated you, I'll pay you back. I'll reimburse what he took. I'll give you another story. Another ancient story of a guy who was minding his own business, and he was robbed. He was literally robbed, beaten up so bad he was going to die, laying on the side of the road. And several people, 3 people at least, walked past this guy, looked at him, and they came up with all these excuses why they couldn't help this guy. In fact, the people that walked past him were the religious people. They had their agenda, they had their title, they had their garb. They weren't going to get themselves dirty to help this guy that was bleeding in on the side of the road. But a non-religious guy, a guy that came from maybe a different part of that region, saw this guy that was hurting, that was broken, that was dying, that was robbed. So he decided to pick him up, to literally take him to a place to pay for his care. And then he said, if there's anything that hasn't been paid for yet, I will pay the difference off when I come back again. He had no relationship with the guy at all, but he saw a hurting guy on the side of the road and said, I'm going to stop and make a difference. I'm going to stop and help. Just in January of 2018, I was heading to a meeting down in a certain part of the state, and it was an ice storm that came through there the prior day, and I was hoping that the roads had been salted and cleared. Well, I turned or went on a bypass or started to go on a bypass. I hit some ice, spun my Jeep, ran off the side of the road, down in a gully, chopped down a yield sign, and I was obviously unable to go to this meeting. But the point of the example is that after I wrecked, and as I wrecked, nobody stopped. Everybody, there were dozens of cars that just kept going right by. They saw me go down the ditch, they saw me spin the whole bit, and they just kept going. And I wonder if you've been on both sides of that coin. You've been in the ditch, you've wrecked, you're in an emotional disaster, and people just keep driving past you because they have an agenda, they have something to do. Or maybe you have seen people on the side of the road that are hurting, they're broken, they're discouraged, and you just wished somebody would stop and give you an encouraging word. Paul was telling Philemon, he says, even though this guy Onesimus messed up, it's okay. It's okay. Treat him like you would treat me if I came, because Paul hadn't done anything to this guy. He says, treat him like a brother. So Paul's suggestions to Philemon was really challenging this guy to look at this guy in a very different light. So he kept encouraging him over and over again. So think about the broader concepts of what this story is all about. John Maxwell talks about it in one of his books. He says we're not supposed to let emotion lead us. Man, do I have a ways to go in that. Don't let emotion lead you, because emotion is like a boat. We were, a few years ago, we were offered a boat ride out into a bay. And I have never gotten seasick in my life. I mean, I like the water. I like being on the water, I like being near the water. But we were out on the bay, and the chops were really high. And there were, I'll guess 40 people on the boat that day. And the boat was rocking so much, and oh my gosh, I was getting so sick. I had to go into the inner part of the boat, putting my head down on the table. And again, I hadn't had those issues before. And then I remembered reading somewhere, again, reading is really important, that if you look on the horizon, if you keep your eye on the horizon, that doesn't change like the boat changes up and down, the tendency that it will help you become less seasick. So I thought, hey, why not give it a shot? Maybe it's in the book, maybe it's the truth. So I started looking at the horizon. And as I stared more at the horizon, the less sick I got because the horizon didn't change. Emotions are like being in that boat, up and down on a windy day, because when you're up, you're feeling good, but when the boat's down and you're rocking, you're not feeling so good. So for you and I that might be struggling with that, we got to find that happy medium to try. It's not always successful, to keep your eye on the horizon that never, ever changes. Sometimes you and I have to initiate the contact. Paul initiated the contact with Philemon, didn't he? It wasn't necessarily the other way around. So sometimes you have to take the first several steps if you want to reconnect or rejoin a bridge or rebuild a bridge that has been broken down over the course of years. I've done that a few times in my life. There were some bridges that were destroyed over this reason or that reason, or maybe the bridge just eroded because of lack of contact. That's happened a lot of times with me, because maybe 20 years have gone by, 30 years have gone by, and just because life happens, we've fallen out of touch with each other. So I've decided in different situations to reconnect, rebuild the bridges that have been eroded over a period of time, not because of bad stuff, just because of time. So maybe if you go back and revisit some of those relationships that you've had, not only to learn from these people, but also to serve those folks, I think you're going to find more times than not that your life is far more rich if you would do that rather than allowing the bridges to erode or be destroyed because of apathy. And apathy can definitely destroy your relationship. John Maxwell says that you need to encourage first, then ask permission to talk candidly. That's what Paul did with Philemon. He encouraged him, he kind of buttered him up a little bit, and then he said, you know what, I need to be man to man. I need to talk to you frankly about this relationship that you have with Onesimus. So he again went to talk about it. He says, in fact, sometimes you have to be quick to admit that you have a problem, that you have to admit that you don't have all your stuff together, which then tends to tear down the walls of the other person that you're trying to talk to. So if you come across this person who thinks that you got all your crap together and all your ducks in a row and everything's practically perfect in every way, guess what? They're not going to talk to you. They're not going to want to listen to you at all. But if you're willing to admit that, you know what, you're about 3 nuggets short of a happy meal too, then guess what? Then the tendency for other people are going to say, the walls are going to come down and say, you know what? John doesn't have his stuff together some days, and I don't have my stuff together some days. So maybe we can talk and or learn from each other. Sometimes you have to invest the time with other people if you want to clarify what may have happened in the past that may have broken down a relationship in the past. Oftentimes, at least I found in my life, that sometimes what you think was the result of the breakdown in the relationship was not the cause of the breakdown in the relationship. Think about that a minute. Maybe their perception of what happened is different from your perception of what happened, and now years and years have passed away, and years have passed, and you realize that your why in that relationship or that relationship or that relationship is completely a different why from their point of view. But if you don't open up the dialogue, if you don't open up the conversation about what has happened in the past with some people, certainly not all, but with some people, then maybe those relationships can't be formed again. I learned this a long time ago I used to watch a guy named Larry King. He had a news show. And watching his technique was very interesting. He was a gentleman who asked a lot of questions. He would ask a question and put his fist under his chin and listen to the responses of the other people. In my life, in my own mind, I can't learn if I'm talking all the time. There's an old saying, is the one who asks the most questions win. Again, the ones who ask the most questions wins. So if you and I think we have all the answers and aren't asking questions from people who know a thing or two about a thing or two, as the commercial says on TV, then we're not going to evolve. We're not going to get better. We're not going to learn from different people who may be able to teach us things that maybe we have forgotten about. I think a lot of times you have forgotten things that you really do know, but because you haven't used them in a certain amount of time, they've slipped. You haven't mastered them in a period of time. So Paul used his influence in dealing with this guy to help him rebuild a circle of influence. Paul was really good at building a circle of influence. Maybe that's how he was he did well in his prior life as a guy who was the complete opposite of what he turned out to be. In fact, he was a fanatical guy that believed the opposite of what he died believing in. Think about that a minute. If Paul can be turned around literally and change the way he believed, then maybe you and I too. Let me share a story. Larry Crabb tells a story of a man who knew that he tried to kill himself. His injury was so severe that he should have died, but he recovered and sought out Dr. Crabb for therapy, the story says. The two had been meeting together for some time, and they covered a lot of ground, and Dr. Crabb uncovered what he thought was keen insight into the man's pain, and he seemed to agree. One day, Dr. Crabb was driving and saw the man talking with a friend and felt compelled to pull over and say hi. So the three sat and talked and laughed and shot the breeze for about a half hour or so. When the sessions together were coming to a close, there was considerable healing, and the man had become restored to a place of wholeness. So Dr. Crabb asked him what he thought the turning point was. He expected to hear about how powerful and life-changing the insights were, and how all this was uncovered, and everything that he discussed really helped him in a big way. So instead, the man pointed to the day that Dr. Crabb sat with him and his friend and just invested time. And perhaps his willingness to sit down and take an interest in his client outside of the office made his counseling more effective. But something happened that day. They rested in the presence of one another, the story says. They shared life and they connected. Sometimes you just need, and I need, to get into the world of other people. Think about that a minute. Sometimes you and I just need to get into the world of other people, and sometimes there are people who are so desperate for you to get into their world. Think about that a minute. How many people are desperate for you to feel what they feel, to feel their pain, to truly understand? And that's hard to do because we have our agenda, we have our schedule, we have our routine, we have our lives. But there's people all around us waiting for you to invest into their lives, to take some time and sit on the bench and just shoot the breeze and just talk, because that conversation can literally change their lives in a dramatic way. Paul did that consistently. Paul was willing to stand in the gap for Onesimus when he said, charge it to my account. When he messed up, I get it, he screwed up. He really messed up. Charge it to me. Charge it to my account. I'll pay what he owes. I don't know a whole lot of us that are willing to pay what other people owe. Paul was willing to do that. Paul understood that he was there. He was more interested in building the relationship instead of fueling the fire of the broken relationship. A guy named Alan Alda, who was an actor, producer, he says, begin challenging your own assumptions. Again, begin challenging your own assumptions. Your assumptions are your windows of the world. He said, scrub them off every once in a while, or the light won't come in. I'll be very brutally candid with you here today. There have been some groups of people in the past that I would not even consider hanging out with because of this reason or that reason. I'm not going to get into all that business. But I just would not hang around these people because. I'll leave it at that. So years have passed, decades have passed, and I never chose to hang around certain groups of folks until I decided to start hanging around groups of folks. And those groups have invested in me in ways that I can't begin to describe. So I've put aside, I've lost out on years and years of development and self-development and learning from these groups of people that I should have been involved in years ago, but I didn't because I stereotyped, I judged. So think about the story I shared here today. Paul decided to invest in Philemon. Philemon had a justifiable issue with this guy, Onesimus, and maybe a hatred, maybe a strong dislike. Maybe he was angry. In fact, he was definitely angry at him. Paul says, look, I get it. He messed up. We all mess up. Paul definitely messed up over and over again. You messed up. I messed up more times than I will ever share with you on this show. Think about the relationships in your own life, in your own world, that if you maybe take the glasses off and say, you know what, they've messed up, I've messed up, I can learn from them, they can learn from me. Be like Paul. Try to build those bridges where possible. And I can almost promise you that more times than not, you're going to have a more fulfilled life and a life that's full of information that you would have died not knowing because you haven't gone back to some of those relationships to rebuild them again. My name is John Carver. I appreciate you watching the show, and we'll be back real soon. Thanks so much.